Welcome to the NEC Society's webinar on addressing research gaps and disparities. We are really grateful to our partnership with Pediatric Research for hosting a series of really fabulous webinars. This webinar is dedicated to Freddie, who you see here in the photos. Freddie was born prematurely, was diagnosed with NEC, and thankfully he survived, but he does live with long-term complications of the disease now. And his mother, who you see photoed here, is really amazing. She is the lead of NEC UK, so it's a charity-based organization in the United Kingdom who is joining us in advocating for advancing NEC research, education, and advocacy. And we are really grateful for their partnership and for the amazing work that we do. And we're just really grateful to Maz for sharing her precious son with us and for allowing us to dedicate today's work to him. So we'll go ahead and get started. So if anyone is just getting to know the NEC Society, welcome. We are a 501c3 nonprofit that's dedicated to building a world without NEC. We bring together clinicians, researchers, and patient families to advance research, education, and advocacy. And here are some photos from pre-pandemic. We hope to get back to these times sometime soon. And really grateful to the team who makes our work possible. If you would like to check out some of the work that we do, we have impact reports from 2021 and going back to previous years where we highlight some of the proudest accomplishments that we've been working on, including conferences, other webinars, research and publications and so forth, different resources and tools. So you can check out some of our work there. So here are your speakers for today. We're really grateful to have such an amazing team. I do want to share that unfortunately Drew Bremer is not able to join us today. His daughter is not feeling well, and so he was going to be taking care of her. So we will miss having his energy with us, but he and the NICHD are committed to working to advance research and build a world without this disease. So we are grateful for their partnership and their work. So thank you again to our speakers, and we're excited to hear from everyone today. So just a quick disclaimer before we get started. We are not providing medical advice, and all of our views, the faculty views, are independent from the NEC Society as an organization. So I'm actually going to get us started today. And Ravi, if you want to turn your camera on, Ravi and I are going to be presenting together. And I don't know, Misty, I should ask, do you want to say anything before we get started, since you're moderating with Amy?
Amy, go ahead.
Yes, no, yeah, Misty and I are very excited here today to be able to moderate. Yes, I'd like to introduce you, Jennifer, if that's okay, Jen and Ravi. I have the pleasure of introducing our first two speakers. I think Jen shared some about herself, but she does hold a master's degree in social work, and she has a 10+ years experience working and leading nonprofit organizations. She's an amazing speaker and writer, has written many blogs, and you know, I think what's really important is that she started this amazing society back in 2014 after she lost her son Micah at 11 months of age. And so since then, we have all been continuing to support her and work together to build a world without NEC. And also Dr. Ravi Patel, he is an associate professor of pediatrics and division of neonatology at Emory University. He's a neonatologist and an NIH-funded clinical researcher. And his interests are necrotizing enterocolitis, blood transfusions, and caffeine therapy. And we're very excited to hear about what they have to say today.
Thank you. All right. So we are really excited to share the work that we've been doing with, thanks to support from PCORI since the fall of 2019. So the title of the project is called Building Capacity for PCOR, CER, and the Neonatal NEC Community. And it's really focused on building a research prioritization for our community and patient-centered outcomes research, comparative effectiveness research, if you're not familiar with PCOR or CER. Some quick disclosures. Ravi serves on the data monitoring committee for IBT, and we have received funding from PCORI. I do not have anything to disclose. So thinking about and reflecting like why we even got started on this project, we have been working to build a research collaborative at the NEC Society for years now. And as we worked to bring people together to advance research, there was just not a clear clear path forward. And so we wanted to bring the patient family voice and really integrate that perspective, the patient family perspective and the patient family voice into the dialogue and the process of identifying which topics matter most and we consider most impactful and most urgent to not just patient families, but also clinicians and researchers. And so really working to identify what those priorities are so we know how to use the very limited resources and time and funds that we have to drive forward the most impactful research questions. So that's kind of the background of why we decided to go forward and pitch this project to PCORI. We're very fortunate that this was the third PCORI Engagement Award that the NEC Society received. The other two engagement awards were focused on supporting the NEC Symposium at UC Davis and the NEC Symposium that took place at the University of Michigan in 2019. And so again, we received this engagement award in the fall of 2019, and it has 3 project aims. The first kind of big goal was to build a team that was dedicated to advancing NEC research that's meaningful to patient families and that's really helping us to advance patient-centered outcomes research. We also obviously wanted to determine what the research priorities are. And we wanted to be able to establish a model framework so that other communities and organizations can kind of learn from what we have done and take the lessons and kind of any of our barriers and places where we stumbled and learn from our experience. So that's kind of what we've been working to do these last couple of years. We work really hard to keep patients and families centered in everything that we do at the NEC Society. And so we always start all of our meetings with these photos here. These are photos of team members, children, or team members themselves, because we have some adult NEC survivors on our team who have been personally affected by necrotising enterocolitis. And so these photos really center us and remind us why we do this work and help to really demonstrate the urgency of building a world without NEC as families continue to be affected by this really devastating disease every day. So we're grateful to the families who are involved and who share their children with us. So just to give you a bit of an overview of kind of the project timeline, as I mentioned, we started this project in the fall of 2019. And we began just by recruiting the team, like who do we want on this team of 22 individuals, which I'll talk about a little bit more in depth in a moment. We kicked off the project in early 2020, and then of course COVID hit and we had to reimagine the project because a lot of the project was designed and meant to be in person and have a lot of very interactive in-person experiences, and that obviously had to change. So we kind of hit pause for a moment, reevaluated how we were going to do this work completely virtually and reimagine the project, which is what you'll kind of hear about and see today, which we are really excited about despite the COVID situation and challenge. So late 2020, early 2021, we were working to identify the research topics, and then we were prioritizing those topics that had been identified, and then we're really excited that later this spring, we are going to be sharing the final list with the NEC community. So this is really exciting. So I want to talk a little bit about how we decided who would be on this kind of core NEC PCOR team. We wanted it small enough that we can get things done, but big enough that we were really hearing from a diverse kind of voices of the NEC community. And so we worked hard to make sure that we were intentional about bringing on voices and perspectives from different backgrounds, different life experiences, different skill sets. And we brought on an equal number of patient families who have been personally affected by the disease, as well as an equal number of clinician and researchers who have dedicated their careers to understanding NEC and improving NEC for patients and families. So we're really excited and grateful to each and every one of our team members for making this pretty long commitment to serving on this project. And I want to talk a little bit about how we've invested in our team over the last couple of years. Establishing rapport and building that trust between team members has been crucial. And imagine how much easier it would have been if we were in person, but it was difficult with the COVID situation to build those relationships and nurture that rapport and trust with all virtual. And so you see kind of a silly, fun screenshot there at the bottom of the screen. We really incorporated team building into the last couple of years. And so we had some partners at Third Plateau, which is someone that the Next Society has worked with for a while, who's really helped to push the team building aspect of this project. And the reason why that has been so important is because we need team members to question each other, to provide open and honest feedback, and to really make themselves a bit vulnerable, especially for the patient families, to kind of put themselves out there and to share like why they feel like a certain topic should be more prioritized or more compelling than the other, and should we be considering this question or that question. And so that's why the rapport and trust building has been really a big part of what we're doing to make sure that patient families feel and truly are equitable and equally valuable, just as the clinicians and researchers, and recognizing that we all bring unique and valid experiences and skills and expertise to the table. And then we all also, everyone on the team participated and underwent the PCORI Research Fundamentals training. And I think my colleague Erin is kind enough to share that link in the chat box, because it's a really wonderful way to make sure that all the team members are on the same page in terms of when it comes to patient-centered outcomes research and comparative effectiveness research, which is really a different way of doing research than kind of the traditional method when you're bringing in and working to integrate that patient family voice into the work that we're doing. And so encourage you to check out the Research Fundamentals training. It was definitely helpful to us and our team. And then throughout the last couple of years, we've had a wide series of learning sessions where we bring our core team together and we are all learning together. We have brought in outside speakers and are really working to increase our skills for everybody. And then I also just want to highlight the all-in strategies that we've used. This is the all-in strategies is, I think, I hope Erin is able to share that link in the chat box, but it was something that we developed after our 2019 NEC symposium at the University of Michigan, where people kept asking us, like, how have you been able to put together a meeting that feels like so inclusive and bring so many different stakeholders to the table? Like, how do you do that? And so that kind of outlines how we've done that. And so we've used a lot of those strategies, including referring to everyone by their first name. And so that way the patient families feel just as, valid as the clinicians and researchers on the team as well. So I hope you will consider checking that out and perhaps even learning and using some of those strategies. So I'm going to hand it off to Ravi to talk about our project Kickoff.
Thanks, Jen, and hi everyone. So this it seems so distant. This was our kickoff. Nobody had masks on, and we had a wonderful time in California where we got our team together to kind of launch this effort. And so this was kind of the culmination of bringing together patients and families and clinicians and researchers and creating a kind of shared goals and visions for the project. And we started with, in addition to a lot of the kind of core training and making sure that the teams had a common language of what is patient-centered outcomes research, what is comparative effectiveness research. We wanted to make sure and spend some time for that foundation to be built. At the same time, as part of the aims that Jen had said, we wanted to develop a prioritized agenda for NEC, and this is something that hadn't been done of, what are the priorities, and particularly what are the priorities that patients and families and clinician researchers have together and also as individuals. And to do this, we spent some time in terms of identifying both what were the areas in the field that had been studied, and also to identify areas that need to be studied or that were understudied. And using these tools, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in the next slide, we created a list. The goal was really to get this list of topics that we could use to then have the team work on just determining which of these, they might all be very important, but which of these were of the highest priority. And one of the things we had a lot of discussion about is I think a lot of the team members think in terms of topics as opposed to specific questions. This is something that we got input from one of our advisors, Chris Gale, who had done similar prioritization work in the UK as part of the James Lund Alliance, where clinicians and families and patients, they think a lot in topics and not as much in a specific formal research question. And so that was what we really focused on, is getting topics. We had an open survey where we got stakeholder input from the community. Many of you might have filled this out, so thank you for doing that. And this was to capture from community topics that were of interest or relevant, that were felt to be important to study. And we paired that and what we got from the survey, and out of that emerged 10 themes of topics that really were areas that we found were important from our stakeholders. We paired that with what had been studied, and so we did a literature review. We looked at what were the areas in the field broadly that had been studied. We searched through over 1,700 articles, and from those articles, we identified what were the main topic areas that were studied in those articles, and from that generated a list of topics. And then we also had, and many thanks to Aaron Umberger and Lindsay for taking this on. This was collating and going through stories and blogs and posts that families and patients had submitted that really were very compelling, and the questions that came up in those stories and posts about unanswered uncertainties or things that were questions and topics that families had that they felt were important. When we put all these topics together from these 3 different sources, we ended up with about 157 potential topics. And we worked over a series of 3 rounds to consolidate these topics into a list of 32 topics that were closely aligned, and this was where our team started the work on actually prioritizing these topics. So the first part, and this was part of our focus from PCORI, so we realized there's lots of topics that are important, but maybe are more fundamental biological questions, and maybe not under the focus of patient-centered outcomes research or comparative effectiveness research. And so we went through 2 steps in our first round of prioritization, and we used the Delphi process. The first was to ask our team, would this topic be something that could generate a question related to patient-centered outcomes research, a comparative effectiveness question? And we had a threshold of at least 70% of our team agreeing that this topic was relevant to PCOR and CR. And the second was to rate this on a Likert scale in terms of the priority of importance in terms of how important this topic was to be studied. And so from the first round, we had out of 22 of the patient-centered outcomes research and comparative effectiveness topics, we identified top 20, and we had those ranked. And we also then identified very important 10 topics that were more fundamental questions that we plan to report and share with the community, but that were not moving on to the next round, which was really focused on PCOR-CR topics. And we had time to discuss the rankings, and for each of these topics that were ranked in the first round, there were comments that were raised that allowed perhaps some more clarity and descriptions of these topics. And the same team that we assembled went through a second round of ranking, and we've just completed this. And for this round, we really focused on these top 20 PCOR and CR topics to prioritize and rank them in a very similar approach using a Likert scale, but also to use a second approach, which was if you had to choose 4 of these 20 topics, which would be the 4 that our team felt were the highest priority. Acknowledging that these are all very important topics and for many of our patients' families, very personal topics, but out of this, which were the highest priority. And from that, we are working now, and we've just kind of finished the second round on generating an overall list of how our full team prioritized these topics. But one thing that was important and that came out of this work, and also a lesson we learned from our advisor and Chris Gale, was also to separate this out into those topics that were of highest priority to our patient families and also to our clinician researchers. And that each of these three lists tell different stories and are all important. And so this is what we will plan to report when we share this in our final results in May. I'll say that one of the things we did find is just a finding from our second round is actually that for the top group of about 4 to 6 topics, actually that patient families and clinician researchers both view those those were where there was really a shared importance of those topics. And then as you get through some of the others, that they were important, but there's different prioritization by patient families and clinician researchers. And so we're really delighted once we have a chance to finalize this, to share all of these 20 topics and more details about this in May as part of research priorities that I think we hope will be important to groups like the NEC Society in terms of establishing focus areas and priorities, but we also hope that this is going to be important to the broader NEC community. And we really look forward to seeing the input and feedback and hopefully the use of this effort to the broader NEC community. So mark this in your calendars. We hope to see many of you again in May where we share this list. And I think through the process this far, there have been some important lessons that I think we've learned and we wanted to share, and I think there'll be more that we learn as we continue this process over the course of this year. As Jen mentioned, team building was really essential and probably one of the most fun, but also one of the most critical parts of this project was really getting to interact and building that rapport and comfort between potentially groups of stakeholders that hadn't previously interacted before, with patients and families and clinician researchers really interacting regularly in a space that might have been very new and foreign. As I mentioned, easier to consider topics than specific questions. I think we went through with our team that we really wanted topics with granularity. So for example, as opposed to treatment of NEC, really becoming more specific about specific treatments of NEC, that was important in terms of being able to prioritize topics. I'm going to let Jen touch on kind of some of the aspects that were a little bit unexpected but important in terms of kind of effects on patient families.
Yeah, the NEC Society's work, often we always work to bring patient families into this. And as a bereaved mother, and my colleagues, they are bereaved mothers or have personal experience with NEC, we know that this work can be emotionally painful and difficult. But what I think we failed to recognize before we jumped into this project is that there really is the potential for re-traumatization for some families, and that we all experience our participation in projects like this and even our work at the NEC Society very differently. And so while some families are able to do the work and are able to participate and cope with the pangs, I would say it is probably painful and emotionally difficult for a lot of families that have gone through really devastating and difficult experiences. But for some, it's kind of more extreme and more difficult. And I think we've learned that we need to be much more trauma informed than we've ever been before. We've never really had never really considered that, and just much more sensitive and thoughtful and intentional about the language that we use, how we approach families and encourage them to participate. And just as an example of one point that families had on our team had trouble with is, as they were ranking the different research topics in terms of priority, they were reflecting on how the answers to these topics could have potentially saved their child's life. And it was families who had lost their child, and just reflecting on how difficult it is to acknowledge that there are so many unanswered questions in the NEC community. There's so much that we still don't know, and just how overwhelming it can be for families to see how much we still don't know, and how much work we need to do, and just reflecting on what that means for not just their family, but for other families in terms of our ability to get to that vision of a world without NEC and to be able to prevent this disease. We still have a long way to go, and that can be really difficult for families. So just, again, it's helped us to become more familiar with some resources focused on becoming trauma informed and the language that we use, and making sure that families always know that they have an out, that they can take a step back, they can turn off their camera, they can choose to not participate in certain aspects of the project, and we will never question, we will always understand, and always just making sure that we're keeping the families centered in everything that we do and providing that meaning and honoring them. So thanks, Ravi, for letting me recognize that. I'll let you take the last one.
And I think the commitment of our team and it's really been as difficult as this has been. I think we really, it's been really incredible to learn and to hear some of the stories and really the impact of kind of what we need to do to move the field forward. The last is kind of the individual, separating out individual priorities from the priorities of the NEC community, the team. And I think one of the things we realized as we looked at some of the rankings in the first round was that for any of these topics, there was a wide range of how individuals within our team prioritize this. And I think that reflects the diversity of the stakeholders we had on our team. But that as we went through these two Delphi rounds, it became very clear that there was this consensus among really the top priority, I would say the top 4 to 6 research topics that were really prioritized by our groups. And so we really look forward to kind of sharing that with you in May.
I just wanted to quickly highlight our team. I wasn't able to get everyone's photo on this slide, but these are some of our core team members who have participated in this project. Again, going back to fall of 2019, and some of them have been very engaged and involved in the NEC Society for even years before that. And so just wanted to highlight and thank all of the clinicians, the researchers, and especially the patient families who have really poured in so much of their expertise and time and just heart into this project. So we're really grateful to each and every one of them and more. There's many more faces behind this project and all the work that the NEC Society does. So just wanted to highlight and recognize and thank our team. And yeah, I wanted to open it up for any questions if we have time, Amy and Misty.
That would be great. For those of you that joined late, we'll just introduce ourselves. I'm Misty Good. I'm a neonatologist at UNC Children's, and we are so thankful to have Jen and Ravi talking about the NEC Society today. So just a reminder to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box, and I'll go ahead and start us off. I have a question for Jen. So I just know that I am personally so inspired by all the work that the NEC Society does, and certainly, you know, on the darkest of days, when we have a bad day in the NICU, we can always remember how much your team is, you know, doing to build a world without NEC. And can you talk about your guys' next steps as far as with regards to research prioritization or next steps in general?
Yeah, thank you, Misty. So as Ravi said, I think one of the highlight first next step is just our May webinar, the May 26th webinar, where we're actually going to share and reveal what the prioritized research agenda is. We're really excited about that. Beyond that, we are also building that framework that I kind of mentioned at the beginning was part of the project AIM. So that way other organizations and disease communities can kind of take what we did and learn from us. And then beyond that, we're actually working to build what we're going to call a research incubator at the NEC Society, where we're going to be bringing together clinicians and helping to really allow them to take up these priorities and address them. In addition, we are hoping to the NEC Society to take up some of the questions ourselves and to actually advance that research with our NEC Society team of patient families and clinicians and researchers who have gone through the PCORI Research Fundamentals training together, who have worked on this project. And so now, you know, we've been working to build those priorities. And so now we want to begin to address the questions and really hope to solve and get some answers to all the questions that remain. Ravi, do you have anything you want to add?
I think it's going to be helpful. I know my own experience is it's illuminating, because what I would have thought would be priorities actually were maybe not as high as it was in this collective experience of getting a kind of a shared priority. I think it's really valuable to understand what's important to the community at large, because as an individual researcher, I think we all have our own individual areas of focus, but this is, I think, stepping back and reflecting a little bit more broadly about what's important to the communities and our stakeholders.
And I also just want to add, and emphasize how important it will be for us to maintain engagement with our team members who we've invested in these last couple of years, and not kind of letting them disperse and do their own thing, but really keeping them engaged in the NEC Society's work, and especially the patient families who have worked so hard to understand how to participate in PCOR and CER and what, how they can contribute. And so we're going to be looking for ways to continue to engage them and involve them and keep them integrated into the work that we do at the NEC Society.
I just wanted to add, as a neonatologist and researcher that's been a part of this initiative, I mean, the experience has been incredible. It's true multidisciplinary patient, family researcher initiative, just a bunch of really invested people that want to make a difference. And one of the things I don't know if the audience knows, but, part of this was virtual because of COVID. And I just was very impressed by you know, the ability for us to continue this work even through Zoom.
That's
Thank
a really
you,
good
Amy.
point.
Yeah.
Really good point, Amy.
Do you have a question, Misty?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to also add, I know Ravi kind of mentioned this, but I think it's worth stating again that we really hope that these research priorities that we reveal in May will be taken up by the world, by the NEC community around the world, and that it's not just useful and helpful to the NEC Society, but our friends at NEC UK, Maz, who you see here, who leads NEC UK, she and I are already talking about, what potential questions they could take, because some of the questions will be appropriate for the NEC Society to address, but some will be way out of our wheelhouse. And so we hope that the NEC community will come together, look at these priorities and begin to kind of take them and address them. So I'm excited, and I hope that it just leads to more engagement and really picks up the momentum of research in the NEC community.
That's really wonderful. Thank you both so much for that great presentation and all that you and the whole entire team does. We'll go ahead and go to our next speaker to keep us on time. I have the absolute honor of introducing Dr. Gerri Baer, who's a neonatologist and supervisory medical officer in the Office of Pediatrics Therapeutics at the FDA. Dr. Baer works hard to ensure that the most vulnerable members of our population are protected, and that they have an advocate at the table where all new drugs and devices are discussed. So it's absolutely our pleasure to have Dr. Baer here, and I'll go ahead and let her tell us all about defining and assessing clinical benefit, a regulatory perspective. Thank you so much, Dr. Baer.
Thank you, Misty. I need to figure out how to get my camera on. So, trying not to be one of those people who's still clueless 2 years into this pandemic. Okay. So thank you so much to the organizers, to Jen, Cami, and the NEC Society for inviting me to give this talk. I'm always surprised when people want to hear what the FDA has to say, but I've had the pleasure of interacting with this group on a couple of other occasions at the NEC Symposia, and I really welcome the opportunity to continue this dialogue. And so I really thank you for inviting me. I also, I have to say, Ravi, that was quite a teaser. I was not entirely aware of the PCORI project, but it really truly sounds, it sounds intriguing, and I'm putting the May 26th date on my calendar because I'm really curious to hear what the group came up with, in particular, with the input of families and patients who've experienced what NEC can do. And so I'm really excited to hear about those priorities. And I think the way that you all focused is really, really remarkable. So thanks for that teaser. So disclaimers, the views here are not the views of the FDA, but they're personal. If there are specific product development questions, they need to be discussed with the relevant review division or center. I will not be talking about off-label drug use, although we know that drugs are often used off-label in neonates, and I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. And I threw this slide in here. I often, I think I've presented a similar slide each time I've presented to the NEC Society. And I put this in because the last several, the webinars that preceded this, which I had the opportunity to listen and watch most of them, really are phenomenally addressing the underlying science, which is where we're still, there are still tremendous gaps in the basic science. And that, can you see my cursor there? That, maybe here, that, the science, oops. The science is really on this sort of pre-discovery end where you're trying to figure out what are the molecular targets, what are the genes or proteins that are upregulated or downregulated, and where can we stop the NEC process from creating havoc for these kids. So really that work is incredible. And what I'm going to talk with you about is more in the middle here in this in the sort of clinical trials and FDA review piece. It's way further down the road. from a lot of this discovery and basic science. So just to kind of put that into perspective, that we're skipping over a lot, but I hope to be able to give you a little bit of an insight into what FDA is looking for in terms of new approvals. So FDA's modern regulatory functions. I don't know, maybe I'm just a nerd, but I love the history, and so bear with me for a brief historical context. The regulatory functions began in 1906 with the Pure Food and Drug Act. That act basically prohibited interstate commerce of adulterated and misbranded food and drugs. And so that was the first sort of modern regulatory legislation that was passed. And then in 1938, after the elixir of sulfanilamide, which contained a poisonous solvent, diethylene glycol, that product killed 107 people, most of whom were children. Congress passed the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which required that drugs had to be safe before they were marketed, and also authorized quality controls and inspections. So between 1938 and 1962, drugs and drug products only had to be shown to be safe but not effective. And today we're going to talk mostly about effectiveness. So in 1962, the same year that thalidomide was found in Europe to cause birth defects, incidentally, many of you have probably heard me say this, but Dr. Francis Kelsey at the FDA prevented it from being approved in the US and basically kept it off the market and averted, the disastrous, unfortunate consequences that had happened in Europe. But that was the same year that the that the Kefauver-Harris drug amendments were passed. And those required that manufacturers of drug products establish substantial evidence of effectiveness before approval. And then in 1983, another sort of relevant piece for NEC and other uncommon conditions, the Orphan Drug Act provided financial incentives and marketing exclusivity for companies that are developing drugs for conditions affecting fewer than 200,000 people per year in the US. So you can see how this may be relevant to necrotizing enterocolitis as well. And then in 2002 and 2003, we had BPCA and PREA, which established the carrot and the stick. BPCA is the Best Pharmaceutical for Children Act, and PREA is the Pediatric Research Equity Act. The carrot, BPCA, is that companies can gain additional marketing exclusivity for completing studies that are requested by the FDA. They don't have to complete them, but they can gain additional financial incentive for that. And then the stick, so to speak, is PREA, which requires that any application for any new active ingredient, a new indication, a new dosing regimen, or a new route of administration, all of those possibilities, if you're applying to the FDA for any of those in the adult population, you have to include a plan for a pediatric assessment, so evaluated in pediatrics, or show that it doesn't need to be evaluated in pediatrics, basically. So PREA basically means that we have to look at everything that's coming through to see if it might be applicable to kids, including neonates, and determine that whether we would like studies to be done. And then 2012, the FDA Safety and Innovation Act required neonatology expertise to exist at the FDA. So another benefit for necrotizing enterocolitis. We neonatologists are included on all these discussions around BPCA and PREA about which new drugs should be studied in pediatric populations, including neonates. So that's a little walkthrough history. So I told you that substantial evidence of efficacy came in 1962 with the Kefauver-Harris drug amendment. So what does that mean, substantial evidence of efficacy to approve a product? That evidence must consist of adequate and well-controlled investigations, including clinical investigations. And the importance of these adequate and well-controlled investigations is to distinguish the effect of a drug from other influences, such as spontaneous change in the course of disease, a placebo effect, or a biased observation. Spontaneous improvement may be relevant in some neonatal trials babies grow, babies improve, babies get better. So it's important to have a comparator so that you can see what is actually being affected as opposed to the spontaneous improvement. And then the biased observation is an area that we see in a lot of trials. And so when interventions are en masse, there's always a possibility of a biased intervention. You will also notice that the Kefauver-Harris amendments require adequate and well-controlled investigations. That's plural. So at that point, it was interpreted as requiring at least 2 adequate and well-controlled trials to establish effectiveness. So what is adequate and well-controlled? We have all these buzzwords and acronyms. So adequate and well-controlled trials are described in FDA regulations as those that have clear objectives and methods. They're designed to permit a valid comparison. They have appropriate subject selection, minimization of bias, and the methods of assessing subjects' response, in other words, endpoints, are well-defined and reliable. So in 1997, the FDA Modernization Act amended that statute to allow for some flexibility, allowing for 1 adequate and well-controlled trial plus confirmatory evidence, which could be another trial. It could be a phase 2 trial. It could be a slightly differently designed trial. So the confirmatory evidence provides substantiation of the results of the single trial and helps to limit the possibility of a false conclusion of effectiveness. The statute does not define confirmatory evidence, but this, as I mentioned, allows for some flexibility in applying the regulations. So guidances are FDA's way of communicating with investigators, drug developers, and researchers in terms of what are the FDA's current thought processes and approaches to all kinds of issues. So in response to FDAMA in 1997, the focus was really the quantity of the evidence, but the guidance was updated in 2019, and it addresses standards of effectiveness, quality of evidence, as well as quantity of evidence, and describes some examples of clinical circumstances where additional flexibility may be warranted. So flexibility may be required in life-threatening conditions or severely debilitating conditions that have an unmet need, and in rare diseases. And if you're a nerd who likes to read these things, they actually are quite they are quite interesting. If you're involved in clinical trials or designing clinical trials, this one, the one I cited at the bottom, is the key guidance for demonstrating effectiveness. So let's break down some of these elements that are mentioned in the guidance about how to demonstrate effectiveness. So one of the elements of quality is how well designed the trial is. But design alone does not determine whether the data will be sufficient to establish evidence of effectiveness. On the other hand, compelling results may overcome challenges that are associated with designs that are not standard, blinded, and concurrently controlled, randomized controlled trial. On the other hand, any design, even if you have a perfect design, if it's poorly executed, you can render that trial not adequate and well controlled. For example, if you had a randomized controlled trial with unintentional unblinding, or you had a subjective endpoint that was, not able to be independently verified, regardless of the design, that evidence would be hard to accept as compelling. One of the issues with neonatal trials in NEC and in other conditions is that we're often looking for some relatively subjective endpoints, such as days on respiratory support, feeding tolerance, discharge readiness. These can be used. However, it's really important that there be standardized guidelines and criteria that are followed during the trial, so that various, individual clinicians or investigators or sites are not treating patients differently, because that will render the results of the trial enormously difficult, if not impossible, to interpret. How much of the impact is due to what center, what doctor you were treated by, versus the intervention that you're hoping to show is effective. So another element of quality is the choice of endpoints. One of the characteristics that's listed for adequate and well-controlled trials is that the methods of assessment of subject response are well-defined and reliable. So that's the endpoint. The endpoints need to be well-defined and reliable. Primarily, we're looking for clinical endpoints, and occasionally there are appropriate surrogate endpoints. Some of the surrogate endpoints that have been approved over long periods of time in the FDA are, blood pressure is a biomarker, it's a surrogate endpoint. But we know from many long-term studies that elevated blood pressure over time will increase your risk of stroke or heart attack. But they do require clinical trials to show that the surrogate is accurately predicting a clinical benefit. And then in the middle here, the demonstrated effect, so the endpoint needs to be clinically meaningful. And this comes into play a fair bit with neonatal trials. I think we had talked in the previous slides about days on respiratory support. So if one group has 8 days on respiratory support and the other group has 7 days on respiratory support, is that a clinically meaningful difference between the two treatment groups? Maybe it is. But that it's important to ensure that when you're designing the study that the effect that you're looking at needs to be clinically meaningful. So I will also say, relevant to this, to NEC and developing therapies, that we often will see, and it's important in your phase 2 studies that are not your large pivotal trials, but the phase 2 studies will frequently include several exploratory endpoints that are intended then to help inform the primary efficacy endpoint in the pivotal clinical trial. You can get a lot of data, measure a lot of endpoints, and see which ones appear to be both clinically meaningful and reliable and predictive. So, the primary efficacy endpoint is one of the main drivers, and most of you are well aware of this, of the trial design and feasibility. And so when you're starting out, it's important to really look at whether the goal is to prevent or treat a condition, because those trials end up requiring rather different designs. So for prevention, the at-risk population needs to be identified. So you don't want to include everyone in your trial if not everyone is at risk. So you need to identify the at-risk population, and you need a clearly defined endpoint or condition that you're trying to prevent. In a treatment trial, the condition needs to be well defined. So who has the condition, inclusion and exclusion criteria, and then the outcome of interest should be reliably measurable. Both short-term and long-term endpoints are important, but clearly we all recognize both, in the regulatory realm, in the pharma and in academic medicine, that we can't wait until the kids get into high school to know whether the whether the treatment they had at 4 days of life worked in terms of making, in terms of improving their SAT scores. So long-term endpoints are important, but they're not necessarily critical for development and approval of a new product. And then my last bullet here, one of the approaches that I think helps to clarify efficacy endpoints is to really consider what is the ultimate goal specific to that intervention. So, starting with what do you want to achieve, what do you want to improve or reduce, or or how are you trying to make these children's lives better? So when it comes to NEC, in the case of GI and inflammatory conditions like NEC, endpoints such as growth and development, independence from invasive support, and things like that are likely to be good choices as long as, I'll keep beating that drum, as long as the assessments are well standardized. So your endpoint needs to be clinically meaningful and distinct from other conditions and reliably assessed. This table is from a paper that many of you were involved in. And the authors looked at some of the key health outcomes that are associated with NEC. And we'll get a little bit more into patient-focused drug development in the next couple of slides. But again, important to involve all the stakeholders in getting input into what's important. And one of the things I think is most interesting about NEC and endpoints is that NEC is both a diagnosis, or all of these. It's a diagnosis. It's an adverse event. So for some studies, you want to make sure that the rate of NEC is not higher in the treatment group and the control group. And NEC can also be an efficacy endpoint if you're looking at a prevention. So depending on the context, NEC functions in all these sort of different ways. So what does FDA consider clinically meaningful? Because we did talk about are they doing well in high school? Do they have friends? Are they playing on the playground with the other kids? But what does FDA consider to be clinically meaningful? So clinically meaningful is evidence that a treatment has a positive effect on how a patient feels, functions, or survives. Those are the key buzzwords that we use at FDA. And survives is relatively easily captured, with some caveats to that. But how patients feel and function in daily life may be captured by clinical outcome assessment tools. So they're patient-reported outcomes, they're observer-reported outcomes, clinician-reported outcomes, and performance outcomes. And the key, one of the key pieces that has really been emphasized, especially over the last 5 to 10 years, is that the patient and caregiver perspectives are really, really important. And FDA has developed processes for systematically bringing in more of those perspectives so that staff and the review staff and the leadership and all the folks at FDA can better understand the priorities of the affected communities. So patient-focused drug development is this sort of effort that is ongoing at FDA, and it aims to both facilitate and advance systematic approaches to gathering patient and caregiver input for use in regulatory decision making. They aim to develop best practices to facilitate patient enrollment and minimize the burden of participating in clinical trials. Because we know, saying you go enroll these babies, it's not a straight line. There has to be a good culture of research, a good communication. There are a lot of elements that need to be in place, and minimizing the burden of patients who participate in clinical trials is key. And then, the really important piece is really identifying what is most important to patients related to treatment benefits, risks, and burdens. So really understanding what is clinically meaningful in this population, and is it, and then bringing it back to try to figure out how it can be measured. So this slide will represent really my last comment on how we consider efficacy at the FDA. FDA requires the 2 adequate and well-controlled trials, or 1 adequate and well-controlled trial with confirmatory evidence. Clinically meaningful, we talked about what that means. And the onus, for pharmaceutical trials, the onus is really on the trial sponsor to justify that efficacy endpoint is clinically meaningful, and they've incorporated the patient voice, and that can really bolster their argument. So I can't conclude this presentation without a few moments to talk about product safety. As you all know, if a drug cures one condition but then causes another, we need to sort of reconsider what to do about that. So some of the general safety considerations in developing new products are, the well-controlled trials are really an important part before approval of assessing a product's safety. You can assess whether the extent of exposure at the relevant doses is adequate. You can identify and examine serious adverse events. estimate the frequency of common and non-serious adverse events. And you can identify unresolved safety concerns that need attention before approval or need special post-marketing evaluation. Just a quick note on post-marketing evaluation. If you think about a general clinical trial for approval of a product, you might, especially in the neonatal population, you're going to have a fairly small trial. Adult trials for blood pressure medicines, cholesterol medicines, and other types of medicines, they may enroll thousands of patients. In the neonatal world, we're talking about maybe hundreds of patients. And you may not identify all the adverse events in the original trial. So that's why post-marketing, it's important to keep looking, which we do. So many of you are probably aware of the International Neonatal Consortium, which has developed the Neonatal Adverse Event Severity Scale. Using a scale like this in your clinical trials really can ensure that everyone is speaking the same language when it comes to adverse events. And why is this important? If one study site is classifying a rash as severe when a child has a rash on their foot, and another, a few bumps on their foot, and another site is saying that that's a mild rash, you'll not be grading those adverse events consistently. So it's important that we're all speaking the same language. Neonatal Adverse Event Severity Scale is really important to incorporate into neonatal trials. And then FDA, this is sort of the final slide. FDA has to take all factors into account in the approach to weighing the benefits and risks of a given treatment. First is, what is the therapeutic context? Is this a drug? Is this a disease that has no treatments? Is it a severe disease? Is it a treatment or a prevention? The therapeutic context is really important when you're weighing the benefits and risks. What are the evidence? What do you have in the data for benefit and risk? What are the remaining uncertainties? There's always a remaining level of uncertainty anytime we approve anything. And then finally, what can be done to reduce those uncertainties and manage risk? So sometimes that involves additional studies, and sometimes it involves certain types of pharmacovigilance. So that was the tour de force of FDA efficacy. A couple of take-home points. Demonstrating substantial evidence of efficacy to treat or prevent a condition like NEC, which is uncommon and severe, could potentially involve one adequate and well-controlled trial and the confirmatory evidence. Treatment and prevention trials require different endpoints and designs. Clinically meaningful, we need parent and caregiver perspectives to help determine that. Adverse event data are important to understand benefit and risk. And then the last bullet, there's so much more that I could talk with you about. So if you have questions, feel free to contact me. And just some resources here. FDA has a lot of really helpful educational resources, videos, and things like that on our website. So thank you so much again for inviting me.
Thank you. We really appreciate your amazing discussion. And I think Dr. Hare's now going to open it up for questions.
Yes. Sorry, the volume would not come off. Thank you. Amazing, amazing talk. We do have some questions to get us started.
Okay.
Yeah. Our first one is, given some of the challenges in diagnosis of NEC and various definitions, could you share your thoughts on considerations of how investigators establish reliable ascertainment of NEC?
Reliable ascertainment?
Yeah.
Well, that is the million-dollar question. Yes. Or multi-million-dollar question. I mean, I know that the INC had the NEC working group that published the paper that I referred to earlier, which was concerning itself with some of the ascertainment. It's almost like asking the chicken or the egg. I mean, I think as objective as you can be with some kind of imaging is really important. Expert consensus is really important. and then sort of correlates of what you're seeing that you believe to be NEC. If something looks like NEC and a child then is better 2 days later, and maybe it was a milk protein allergy or some other allergic kind of, then you have to be able to distinguish those. And sometimes for these kind of studies, sometimes you really have to just select the ones that you're very clear on, in terms of being able to know that you're studying the right population. But I don't have any great answers for that. I think that's a terrific project for the next society.
Yes. No, completely. No.
I will also say one other thing. I will say, consistency is really important, and objective measures. So if if a group, if this group, for example, decides that these 3 factors are define what is NEC, as long as you're incorporating the objective information and those data are available for those individual markers or whatnot, you can always go back and say, well, maybe this group didn't really have NEC, or maybe there's a slightly different way that we could define it next time. So I think just recording, getting all the data and being able to follow that along. But I look forward to the next society defining NEC.
Yes, wonderful. So our next question, do you think that success in prevention, I guess of NEC in a mouse model of NEC is sufficient to begin preclinical safety studies?
That is also a great question.
I know.
Yeah. Okay, so do we think that prevention of NEC in a mouse model? So you're basically asking if prevention of NEC in a mouse model would be sufficient to really say that is a prospective benefit for, I guess the question that's underlying that is that enough prospective benefit to potentially go into humans once you have the toxicology studies, the non-clinical toxicology studies. Part of the problem with studying products for NEC is that, as there's no really adult correlate. There are similar diseases that can be looked at in the adult population, but there really is no adult correlate. So it's not like we can take certain products that have been studied for adult necrotizing enterocolitis and then say, all right, we're going to find a dose and then we're going to use this in the neonatal population. We don't have that. So in many cases, if you're developing something new, you may be able to do some healthy adult volunteer studies just to kind of, to look at safety and to look at dosing. But what you need to be able to go into a large neonatal trial, or even a small neonatal trial, is you need to be able to have some prospect that those babies are going to benefit. And so if you're trying to derive that prospect from a mouse model, I would suggest, the mouse model, some of the mouse models are good. I would suggest potentially having a couple of different ways to demonstrate that prospective benefit, either, more than one animal, or some other way to be able to say that the babies that may be enrolled can potentially benefit from this.
Thank you. One more. I think this is a question or a topic that we talk about a lot, about randomized controlled trials. But when we're talking about well-controlled trials, we know in NEC, historically, there's, lots of studies that were going to look at NEC, and at the end, they had to change their endpoint because there weren't many infants that ended up developing NEC. So, what are your suggestions? Because, some of these NEC studies would take thousands of enrollees. And so any thoughts on that?
Right. And I think, what you're referring to is really the preventive studies, because thankfully, we don't have, 40% of all of our BW babies getting NEC. So that's why, you basically defined why it's so difficult to do prevention studies. Ideally, we would have some sort of a biomarker that would help enrich the population and predict who is going to develop NEC. aside from that, I mean, we don't, as far as I know, there's no biomarkers that we're terribly sure of at this point. So it really is, it's kind of a rock and a hard place, I think, with prevention, because, you know, you have this large group of very low birth weight kids who are at risk, but it's very hard to define which subpopulation. I mean, the smaller ones, as we know, are at higher risk, but you know, if you could use, you know, either sort of a serum biomarker or some kind of a clinical risk score that actually correlated to a higher rate of NEC, you know, focusing on those patients may be more efficient.
Excellent.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Baer, for your wonderful presentation.
You're so welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
We really appreciate all of your hard work to protect all the babies. And for those of you, I know there's still some questions coming in. If you want to put your questions in the Q&A, Dr. Baer can answer those as she's able. And
I'll be glad.
thank you so much. As Jen mentioned earlier, we have an update to the lineup today because Dr. Drew Bremer had a family emergency and was unable to join us. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jonathan Litt, who's a neonatologist and health services researcher at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. He's an assistant professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and is supported by a K-23 Career Development Award from the NIH. So we're really excited for Dr. Litt to talk about care integration for infants with medical complexity and providing follow through after the NICU discharge. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Misty, and to everybody at the NEC Society for this wonderful invitation and to be on this just wonderful panel today. I'm excited to share some of our work with you all that we're doing to really help families and infants and young children who leave the NICU with medical and developmental complexity. And while this talk is not specifically geared towards infants with NEC and their families, we certainly know that NEC is a disease that affects not only infants in the NICU, but can produce morbidities over the entire life course. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. In my talk today, I'd like to talk a bit about the care needs after NICU discharge for children with medical complexity, talk about the current approach to follow-up in both high-risk infant follow-up settings and the community-based family-centered medical home, and then to address gaps that we've noted, and particularly to talk about a novel approach for helping families and infants in this population. As we all know, premature birth impacts functioning of all organ systems and can lead to morbidity both in the newborn period and infancy and later childhood. And I'm particularly interested in my work in outpatient follow-up is particularly focused on children with medical complexity, which is defined as having a chronic multi-system health condition that affects function and can cause functional limitations. It also leads to substantial healthcare needs and high resource use. And we know that children with medical complexity, here represented as CMC as a shorthand, represent only about less than 1% of children in the US. They account for more than a third of total pediatric healthcare costs. And so this is a particular population of interest for us as neonatologists and healthcare providers in the outpatient setting who care for children with multiple needs. We know that in particular, ELBW infants, those who are most likely to be at risk for a disease process like NEC, have significant care needs after they go home. And this is some data that we have reported from the New England Follow-Up Network, which is a group of follow-up programs in the 6 New England states, and found that of the ELBW infants who were eligible for follow-up, 85% of them needed some type of supportive service or therapy after going home. And you see that 39% needed some sort of oral feeding support. Many needed enteric tube feedings. 33% 33% needed rehospitalization in that first couple of years after NICU discharge, and 32% needed to have a surgical procedure after being discharged from the NICU. Groups are now reporting that these health service needs actually continue throughout childhood and actually into early adulthood, with unrecognized and unmet physical health problems among low birth weight infants who are now young adults. We know that there are significant barriers to early intervention and other supportive services for infants and young children with medical and developmental needs after they leave the hospital. And then interestingly, we're finding that even things like childhood vaccinations are disrupted by a NICU experience. And this paper that was published in the last few years noted that about, I think 60% or so of infants leaving the NICU had either missing or delayed vaccinations. So even those things that we think of as sort of the core of just typical well child care are disrupted. We also know that follow-up after NICU discharge is both inconsistent and inequitable. So again, from our work with the follow-up network here in New England, found that only about half of the eligible babies were followed through 2 years of age, which is the recommendation. And this finding is consistent with what other groups around the country and actually internationally have found. And again, I'll just pause to say that this is for clinical follow-up, not follow-up that's part of a randomized controlled study or a trial or some other kind of research follow-up study. We also have noted that there are inequities to follow-up, particularly based on race, ethnicity, primary language spoken in the home, and as Dr. Freeman, who is a colleague of mine here at Beth Israel, noted, neighborhood opportunity. So the kinds of neighborhoods children come from actually impact the likelihood of being followed. You can see here, this is a map, a care map that a family put together for their child with special needs. And for anybody who's on the call today who either cares for a child with medical complexity, either in their professional capacity and or in their own family, this may look familiar to you. You'll see that the child and family are here at the center of this care map. And the parent was asked, okay, list all of the services, all of the supports, all of the sort of stuff that needs to happen around supporting and caring for your child. There are a couple of things that really strike me about this map. The first is just how complex it is, right? That there are just so many different factors. The other is that you'll notice health is only one part of it, and it's sort of located here in the left lower sort of quadrant of this map, right? And these are all the health services, but you see that wide array of services that are provided in a number of different settings, including school, community settings, legal, financial, and other kinds of supports. So we know that the care that children with medical complexity receive after leaving the NICU is variable. It's complex, as I really nicely represented in that family's mapping of their child's care. And it's also fragmented by different providers who are providing services in varied settings. We know from the adult literature, at least, that this kind of care fragmentation leads to gaps in care and increased costs. And it also can lead to increased ED visits and hospitalizations. So what are some responses, right? What might we do about it? Well, the family-centered medical home has really been the recommended care model for pediatric care for the last, I'd say, 4 decades at least. The medical home is comprised of 5 different facets. One, that you have a usual source of both sick and well care. The second is that you have a personal doctor or nurse, someone that you can name as your child's caregiver. The third is to have access to needed referrals when it's appropriate. Effective care coordination is the fourth. And the final one is an element of family-centeredness, which really has to do with both cultural humility and communication with the family. We know that the medical model for pediatrics is associated with improved access to services, greater family satisfaction with care, lower healthcare costs, and interestingly, a lower likelihood of having a functional disability if you're a child who has complex needs. And that's the good news and the positive. Unfortunately for our NICU graduates, we've actually found that they don't have the same access to a medical home than their term-born peers who did not have a NICU stay. I first noticed this actually when we were doing a pilot study for a different reason, thinking about our follow-up program here in Boston, but noted that only 15% of these 48 infants received care in a family-centered medical home. And this struck me as rather odd, considering our assumptions about the care that is being delivered in a city like Boston with what we would assume to be lots of access to community-based, high-quality community-based pediatric care. We also noticed that there was no difference for those with and without special healthcare needs. So it didn't really matter how complex your needs were, you were just as likely to have a medical home. This prompted a second study looking at a national survey of children's health, a representative sample, and found, again, a lower likelihood, decreased odds of having a medical home if you're preterm versus term-born. And there were also notable and significant racial and social disparities in who had a medical home and who didn't. And actually the 2020 edition of the data from the National Survey of Children's Health was just released. And though I haven't done a formal analysis, I did look to see has this changed. And unfortunately, really not so much, that only 42% of children with special healthcare needs currently have a family-centered medical home. So what do we do? Particularly considering that community-based primary care is actually often not considered the medical home for NICU graduates with medical complexity. And certainly in our practice here at a quaternary center like Boston Children's, often children who have significant medical needs when they leave the hospital at NICU discharge look to their subspecialist as their primary source of care. For the children with neck and associated complications, often that's either our growth and nutrition program or our surgical subspecialists, or children with chronic lung disease who are seeing their pulmonologist very frequently in that first year, look to their pulmonologist as their sort of usual source of care or their medical home. Care is also provided in by multiple services in varied settings, and it's both in the hospital, in the community, by school supports and other kinds of therapeutic supports. And we need to recognize that care needs change over time, and that the kinds of needs and supports that are needed and are really optimal for children in those first few months after they go home from the NICU are going to change by the time the child reaches school age and beyond. So one response is to help integrate care, to develop a model, to integrate care among all of those providers and across settings, and to really make sure that it's flexible over time. So this brings me to a project that we're working on now to develop a novel approach to high-risk infant follow-up, particularly for children with complex needs. And this is really all centered on this idea of care integration, this wonderful definition by my colleagues at Boston Children's with the integrated care program, that says that integrated care is the seamless provision of health services from the perspective of the patient and family across the entire care continuum, and is essential to achieving the best health outcomes for every patient. And care coordination is really sort of at the heart of it. The core activities, in addition to care coordination, are a high-quality handoff between and among providers, care mapping, as I showed you an example of earlier in the talk, action planning and setting goals, and then measurement. Because of course, if we can't really measure what we're doing, we might not notice any gaps that we then need to address. And I put here on the slide as well a kind of a heuristic that was developed by my colleague, Lindsay Rosenfeld, who's a health literacy expert, really trying to make clear that the care we provide to families who have special needs after they go home from the hospital are really need to be contextualized, and that this idea that children live in homes, in communities, and in broader neighborhoods, and that there are effects of both local and more broad regional policies that may have an impact on access to care. Rich Antonelli, who's my mentor at Boston Children's in this area of care integration, has really put together a very nice schema of what integrated care means and the components that will help us make integrated care successful. The first is that it's team-based, okay? And so we need to make sure that both medical and non-medical personnel and all members of the team, including the family, are sort of identified and have clear responsibilities, that there's efficient communication among all care team members, and that there's a systematic way of sharing knowledge. The second is a connection to life and community, and this again is both in medical and non-medical settings, connecting resources and sharing information, and really understanding what is the impact on the family of not only the disease process that might be happening, but of the care plan that's set forth. What's the impact on the functioning of that family, of the other siblings in that family? It's really important to incorporate that into this entire care plan. And the last is future care planning, with having sort of both medium and longer term plans that are, and I think this is critical, time bound in terms of setting goals. Because if we don't have a sort of an understanding of what's the bigger picture here and what is the time frame we're talking about, I think it's then easy to get sort of lost in all of the complex minutiae of sort of trying to figure out what needs to happen every step of the way. So to these ends, we're actually working on a demonstration project right now at Boston Children's Hospital that is supported by MassHealth, which is our state Medicaid provider, and being led by the Boston Children's Department of Accountable Care and Clinical Integration. And the idea is to develop a novel population health management care integration model for the care of infants who are leaving the hospital with a certain amount of medical complexity. And I'll say that our patients with NEC and BPD are sort of the top of that list in terms of who's being prioritized to develop this model. And with that in mind, our partners in the Growth and Developmental Support Program, which is the NICU follow-up program, we have a wonderful partnership with the Center for Healthy Infant Lung Development, which is our pulmonology team that takes care of children with BPD, and our Growth and Nutrition program, which is run by gastroenterology and helps support any infants with feeding issues after leaving the NICU. There are 4 different components to this project and this care model. The first is clinic-based population health management, and I'll describe that in a moment. The second is proactive patient and care tracking, that I'll describe as well. The key here is interprofessional education and collaboration, and working together to have shared understanding of what our goals are as providers, and care planning and communication. The population health management piece really begins with this understanding that is very nicely outlined by the AAP, in that population health, this idea of population health shifts the focus from caring for patients as they come into the office one after the other, one at a time, to really proactively managing a practice's patient panel, the whole group of and population that you're helping take care of. The way we've interpreted and translated that for our clinic-based population health management, we've identified a manager, somebody who's being trained in developing these skills to build a care relationship, to navigate subspecialty primary care and community resources with each family, to identify multidisciplinary care team members and provide leadership to facilitate ongoing support across the team, to track progress and challenges along the care plan, and to empower the family in the care of their own child. Part of this involves developing what we consider care tracks to really identify who are the children and families with the highest needs for whom we need to be most responsive, and then who are those families who are really doing well and we can just play a supporting role. There are 5 tracks. The first is the locus of integration, as we're calling it, or sort of the anchor, and it's that family that's really serving as that home for that period of time, who's going to be helping manage all the other supporting, connecting groups. The population health manager identifies those tracks for each program, but I think most importantly is then involved in discussions periodically with peers in the other two programs about co-management of the shared patients. The other part of this, as I mentioned, has to do with care planning. And care planning, there are a lot of iterations of it. And we could talk for an entire hour about that. I certainly won't do that. The model that we're using here, again, was developed and supported by the Integrated Care Program at Boston Children's to use something that actually looks perhaps a bit simple, called the action grid. But I have to say, as simple as it looks, I think there are some really innovative features that are going to be helpful to us as we move forward. The first has to do with goal setting, and you'll see here they're broad, right? And this is an example for a preterm infant who's going home from the NICU. RSV prevention is certainly a goal, support feeding and growth, assess development, et cetera. And then there are actions associated with them. And you can imagine the more complex the needs are, the more numerous and specific those actions would be. One of the innovative things, I think, has to do with identifying who is responsible for this. And this is meant to be shared with every member of the care team, including the family. And I'll say here, there's opportunity for families to add during the care plan meeting, what are your goals? What are the actions associated? And then who's going to be responsible? But this, you can see, is helpful in terms of deciding primary care. Yes, they're in charge of synergist administration, for example. Early intervention will be in charge of assessing and supporting development. There's a time frame associated with it. And again, I think innovatively, as somebody who provides care to this population of infants, a contingency plan. And I think this is especially important for families and primary care providers to be able to see, okay, if something on this care plan doesn't happen, what do I do? Really empowering those who are really in charge at the core of the patient's care, that is the family. What do I do? To whom do I reach out? Who's in charge of this piece of the care plan? So right now, this is a 2-year demonstration project. We've completed year 1, in which we conducted a baseline assessment of family care integration needs using a validated tool of care integration of needs. And we're in the process of analyzing those data from families. We've had monthly interprofessional education sessions, and our population health managers have also had monthly meetups to discuss how to operationalize many of these interventions. And we've launched the patient registry with care tracking. Our goals for the next year are to launch the action grid in each of our programs to measure care coordination management activities and outcomes using, again, a validated tool. And then to repeat the assessments of family integration needs to see if we've actually then met the unmet needs that families are experiencing. And with that, I will wrap up and ask, open up for questions. But I really love this framework from our Canadian colleagues. It really sort of reframe the international classification for functioning for disabilities for children using what they call the F words. And these F words are fitness, function, friends, family, and fun, to really help support and optimize outcomes for children with special needs and with medical and developmental complexity. And I really hope that our unique approach to integrated population health management for this population will help achieve these goals. So with that, I will say thank you and open it up for questions.
Wonderful, excellent talk. Just impressive. I'm still reflecting back to the care map of the family that's impressive on its own. We do have a question from our audience regarding lactation care. So I think part of the challenge is that some of these babies go home and they're not fully directly breastfeeding, or they're still working on feeding. And so part of the patient's not just the baby, but the mom. Or lactating parent. So how are you aware of any novel or effective ways to better integrate this care, especially in light of related health disparities?
Yeah, that is such an important question. And I have two thoughts come to mind that yes, there are programs that do integrate lactation into their high-risk infant follow-up programs. And I'm not actually aware of groups that have sort of evaluated those programs in terms of uptake and participation and outcomes. I do know that here in our neighborhood, many primary care programs practices have lactation support, and that's really where we are working, sort of trying to connect families with. But again, we haven't really studied to make sure that that's actually happening. The other thought that I have is, my dream and my real conceptualization of follow-up is really about the family, right? The infant, of course, is at the center, but moving away from sort of what we used to call infant follow-up to really family follow-up. And I think this is a wonderful example of why that's so important.
No, exactly. Let's see if there are any more. Oh, one other question I had. Oh, here we go. I'd rather get our audience's questions than mine, but how do you handle adequate and timely follow-up for complex kids who do not live close to major children's hospitals and unfortunately might get suboptimal follow-up? Do you consider telehealth?
Such a wonderful question. And I have to say that this pandemic, as challenging as it has been for all of us, one bright spot has been the introduction of telehealth, that we've certainly been able to pivot. And during those first several months of the pandemic, when we weren't seeing families in person, we did pivot to telehealth, and we still have that opportunity to do sort of a hybrid for certain situations. It's something that I've been talking about with colleagues in other parts of the country, particularly rural parts of the country, exactly that, where families may be discharged hundreds of miles away from the nearest center. And I think telehealth really has it's a wonderful opportunity. And there's some people who are doing really great work in trying to develop assessment tools that can be validated for telehealth, particularly for the developmental assessments, because that has been really tricky. I think in some senses the medical follow-up is a little easier. And I will say, as somebody who does follow-up and has done both in person and telehealth, it's a wonderful tool. Families are more relaxed, kids are more relaxed. You get this window, and it's sort of like a home visit, right? You get this window into their lives. You can see them feed, you can see, right? I mean, there's just all sorts of wonderful things you can do. So yes, I think there's more to come in the telehealth space for sure.
Okay, well, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to all of our speakers. And Misty, do you have anything to close with?
Sure. I just wanted to thank all of our attendees and everything that our speakers and everyone else out there is doing to build a world without NEC. And thank you so much for joining. And
hey everybody, thanks Misty, thanks so much Amy, and thank you to our amazing speakers. I wanted to just quickly remind everyone that all of our webinars have been recorded. The first one, the January 28th webinar, is available on our website now. The February 14th one on intestinal development and injury will be up very soon, as well as today's webinar. So you can stay tuned at nexsociety.org for those recordings. I also want to flag that May is NEC Awareness Month. May 17th is NEC Awareness Day. We're going to be highlighting our research priorities. That's kind of the theme of NEC Awareness Month this year. So stay tuned for to celebrate NEC Awareness Month with us and to hear about the research priorities that you kind of got a little today. If you are interested in checking out our online shop, we have some really cool NEC gear to help you celebrate NEC Awareness Month. So we hope you will check out our shop. Again, that's at nexsociety.org. Thank you again to all of our speakers, to our moderators, to our community, and especially to Freddie's family for sharing his story with us. And thank you all so much for joining us. We hope to see you again soon. Take care.